I'm Dave Thurman. I'm Dean and CEO of Northeastern University here in Seattle. And thanks everybody for being here today. Is this thing working? You guys hear me? Okay. We'll get to introductions in a minute. First, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of this session. When we were kind of kicking this idea around in a Technology Alliance planning session, someone pointed out that higher ed institutions are in sort of a unique position because they are both employers and educators. Higher ed employs hundreds of thousands of people across the state and educates that many as well. So we're kind of uniquely situated to look at these changes in the future of work and think about both how it affects us as an organization and how it affects us in terms of how we educate future workers. So we certainly experienced both sets of challenges during the pandemic, seeing changes in how we managed our workforce and moving a lot of our workers remotely, as well as figuring out how to educate students via remote learning. And as Laura highlighted earlier, the pandemic sort of magnified factors that were already in play, forcing us to contemplate flexible work, flexible instruction modalities, remote advising, remote counseling, and a host of other changes in both the classroom and the office. And if the pandemic had been measured in weeks instead of months and years, we probably would have just adapted back to the way things were before, but it wasn't, and people realized that they liked working from home, or they didn't. They liked having more flexibility in their schedule for sure, but that they also suffered because there weren't good boundaries between work and home. And the same is true for students, that the time between when they were in class and when they weren't was blurred a little bit more. Productivity soared in many cases. We heard about that earlier. Creativity plummeted. Maybe the opposite for some people. I'm sure the experience is individualized to every one of us, and we all had slightly different experiences. But I think the question is, what did we learn from this, right? And what are we learning from the pandemic, and how does it cause us to think differently about higher education in the future? What skills do our learners need to have as they go into a workforce that's maybe more flexible, less directly interactive, more autonomous? And how do we as educators need to change what we do in the classroom or outside the classroom to better prepare them for that career in the future? So with me today are three leaders from the state's largest higher ed institutions. Immediately next to me is Dr. Elizabeth Chilton. She is the Provost and Executive Vice President at Washington State University, as well as the Chancellor Designate for Washington State University Pullman, a role she'll assume in January. Dr. Chilton is a professor of anthropology and served in numerous higher education leadership roles at the University of Massachusetts and SUNY Binghamton before joining Washington State University in May of 2020. Thanks for being here. Next to her is Dr. Annemarie Cauce, President of the University of Washington. Dr. Cauce is a professor of psychology who previously served as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and as Provost at University of Washington before being appointed as its 33rd President in 2015. Thanks for being here. And I think everybody in the room knows former Governor Gary Locke, who is the interim president at Bellevue College, the largest of the state's community and technical colleges. Gary was governor of Washington from 1997 to 2005, then served for 6 years in the Obama administration, first as Secretary of Commerce, then as ambassador to China, and he assumed the role of interim president at Bellevue in June of 2020 to bring his experience and history of innovation to that institution. So we're glad to have you here as well. So higher education and the future of work. And I think the opening question, maybe I'll start with you, Annemarie, is how do we think about higher education needing to change in response to everything we're hearing about the future of work, about different work modalities, about hybrid versus and just the changes that are coming in? How do we change as higher educators?
Well, I think that, that it's important to point out, we're all focused on the pandemic now, and it was fabulous to have Margaret O'Mara give us, the big picture. Higher education was changing, and we were becoming more digital, and that was happening well before the pandemic. As she was talking, I was thinking that I had been asked to speak about diversity at a mayor's conference that Bloomberg put together in Detroit just before the pandemic. And at that point, we were talking about the new industrial revolution because we were talking about robotics, AI, the digital transformation, changing the workplace, and it was already doing that at universities. It was about a decade ago, in fact, when we first started doing the early experiments in flipping the classroom. So for example, our biology, 180 class, now rather than being in one big lecture hall with 799 of your closest friends, this is, one of our largest classes on campus, you actually watch the lectures at home, and then you come in small groups to discuss. This started a decade ago, and actually one of the things that's interesting is an evaluation of that work, which was actually published in Science, pretty good journal, actually showed that it was particularly good for low-income kids because they could watch the lecture, multiple times. And now we've been using flipping the classroom, again, before the pandemic, in a couple of other classrooms, but I want to be clear that flipping the classroom is not the same as having someone teach over Zoom. These are very well curated lectures, pieces, etc. So I think it's important to be clear that we were already moving in this direction. Continuum College, we have about 50,000 students in person. We have twice that many online already before the pandemic. What the pandemic has done is it's kind of kicked it up into high gear. And now all of a sudden there is more. I want to first say that there is no question our students are so happy to be back in person. On the first day of class, a number of instructors were telling me how students clapped at the end of class, and some of them say it wasn't because they were that good, although of course, they're all great. But that the question really isn't. It's how are we going to be combining those things? And because I think it's really important to remember that, particularly in higher education, that we are, and some of you know, I'm a child clinical psychologist. I particularly work with adolescents. We're the space, we're the place where people come to come of age. And so it's not, it is about the education, but it's all those other skills. You all know that in your workplaces, the ability to interact with others, all those life skills, all those interaction skills are critical to work. They're critical to life. How many people have met the loves of their lives on campuses, etc. Sometimes when I say the coming of age, I say, you mean sex, drugs, and rock and roll? And I'm saying, well, where else do you want people to learn about those things? And, it's interesting. What the research tends to suggest about online education is it works really, really well for adult learners or for people who are very clear about what they want. And most of our online degrees are about stacked credentials, they're about master's programs, etc. But for the traditional 18 to 25-year-old who hasn't exactly decided what they want to do, it works somewhat less well. I also think that some of the kinds of topics, for example, I teach abnormal psychology, and in person, students talk about their own mental health struggles, those of family members. They don't want to do that online because they don't know who's watching. So, I do think that there's no question that we're going to see already before the pandemic, the typical student took one course online a year. I think we'll be seeing more of that. But I think there's other ways in which higher education has to change, and I'm going to try and be brief because we have great. One is we have to become more integrated. I think this notion of every major being very separate, the big, complicated, hairy problems that we have in society really need this interdisciplinary collaboration. We have really seen that in the pandemic. It's what has allowed us to be at the forefront so quickly. So we are doing more in terms of our buildings rather than just being, here's going to be the history department and here's going to be, our newest building is population health, where we're bringing people together from across campuses, more group spaces. People don't need, in our newer buildings, we don't have the big offices where people have thousands of books and filing cabinets, etc. We have smaller offices and more spaces for people to get together, because I think we're going to need more reintegration. But the other part that I want to bring up in terms of digital education, and then I'll go ahead because we have time for questions, is that we really need to look at it in terms of inequities, and not just in terms of broadband, but also a lot of the people that are working at home, if you have a 2-bedroom home with a nice home office, etc., That's not the case for a lot of low-income families. One of the things that I think really became very clear, for example, on our campus, about a third of our dorms were full. They were mostly the low-income students because their financial aid covered it, and it was a better place for them to study and work than going home. And, again, some people are, have, as I call it, a Zoom with a view, but there are others that are in a closet, and that became very stark in Zoom, that all of a sudden, you could tell the difference between the wealthy students and the not so wealthy students. And we also have to think about working at home. We are in a country that over the last 2 decades has resegregated. We are more segregated now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. And so what does that mean if people are working at home? So, both in terms of education, et cetera. I'm going to go ahead and I can go on.
We will have time for questions later,
right.
so yeah. So Elizabeth, both the University of Washington and Washington State University have a network of campuses, right? Washington State University has 5 campuses across the state in order to bring education to a wider populace. And I think there's like 10,000 students that are enrolled in the network or online at Washington State. And I wonder how this shift to hybrid and the rapid acceleration of technology causes you to think differently about that network in the future and what new programs you might have in the network in the future.
So thank you for that question. We really have 6 campuses because we have an online, what we call our global campus. And we have about 32,000 total students enrolled at our 6 campuses. Interestingly, we saw during the pandemic that our global campus or online campus, as you can imagine, was the only campus that expanded its enrollment dramatically. And our flagship campus out in Pullman with 20,000 students, our enrollment did drop a little bit, but not as much as we had feared. It was our other campuses that in Tri-Cities, in Vancouver, and in Everett, where those campuses primarily serve non-traditional or adult students. That is where we saw the largest drop in enrollment. And I think it is because of the inequities that we're talking about, childcare and elder care responsibilities of the job, taking care of sick family members and loved ones, and access to broadband. And, we did loaner laptops, we did loaner hotspots, we did everything we could, but there are certain inequities that are structural that really did impact. So in terms of, what we take away from this, what we're trying to do is learn from what worked well. As Anna Mari said, we took some of what we already knew about good pedagogy in moving beyond just Zoom teaching into implementing some of those. But we're also learning what the value of that in-person experience is for first generation, underserved, providing residential campus experience for those who need a place where they can work and get access to both internet and quiet learning spaces. So we're really focusing on, being more flexible. This morning's session, we really talked about how in terms of recruiting workers, if you're going to hire a communications professional, maybe they don't need to be sitting there in your office 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. But if you have someone there who's a counselor for students in your on-campus housing, then you really need to make sure that you're getting high quality people. And so that's really the challenge, is being flexible and taking the good, leaving behind the things that didn't work well.
Yeah, I know we had our own definition of what we considered essential workers, and a lot of them were the student-facing people on campus. Gary, Bellevue College addresses a wide range of learners, from high school students in Running Start to maybe first-gen learners that are working on getting their associate's or bachelor's degree, to part-time adult learners, lifelong learners that are coming back and are figuring out how to do that around the demands of family and jobs and that sort of thing. And as you think about the changing future of work, how will Bellevue and the other community and technical colleges sort of adjust their approaches to educating that populace?
Well, I want to echo what Anna Mari talked about, and which is that many of our institutions, most of our institutions, were already have a strong online presence, and whether it's WSU or UW, and certainly the community colleges. I think even before the pandemic, about 25% of our courses were actually offered online, either completely online, asynchronously with students from around the world, around the country, to hybrid models. I think going forward, online education is going to be even more part of the curriculum, part of the daily life, perhaps maybe, as Anamari said, certainly in a hybrid fashion. And I think that it's going to be really true in the community technical colleges. Bellevue College, quite frankly, during the pandemic did not suffer a drop in enrollments. And I think it was because of the infusion of high school students who were enrolled in the Running Start program. And that's a program in our state, which is unique, where high school students, basically juniors and seniors, can take their high school courses and college courses almost simultaneously, dual credit, so that when they graduate from, let's say, Bellevue High School, even though they're taking their courses at Bellevue College, they can go straight into the University of Washington as a junior. So it really saves their family a lot of money and accelerates their education. So we had a huge increase in that because, quite frankly, if Bellevue High School or Issaquah High School is going to be completely online, well, why not be online at Bellevue College and get both high school and college credit? Now that the high schools are back in session, our Running Start students dropped, and so a lot of them went back because of the extracurricular activities. The very same, the personal connection, those activities, the socialization that is so important. In our community technical colleges across the state, about 40% work full or part-time, and about 20% have children or have families. So they're trying to squeeze that education in between work and family. So the normal 2-year transfer degree to go to a 4-year school might actually take them 3 or 4 years. We also have a lot at Bellevue College, a lot of bachelor's degree programs. So it may take them 6 years to get that bachelor's degree. So it's really important that our community technical colleges improve the pathway, the journey to get those degrees, that the courses are available at the right times, that the requirements are very, very clear, are not unnecessarily onerous, especially if they're thinking of transferring to a 4-year school. So we need to be in better alignment with the 4-year schools in terms of course requirements, transfer requirements. But I also think that we need to do a much better job meeting the needs of the students. And I think the pandemic and the familiarity of online services gives us that opportunity and that incentive to do so. I mean, you call up Alaska Airlines if you don't, go online to book a flight. You can call up a customer service rep because maybe you got some unique problem. And I do this all the time. I call at midnight, and the first question I ask is, so where did I reach you? The person's in Boise, or they're in Phoenix, Arizona, or they're in Seattle. There's no reason why a lot of our services for students cannot also be in non-traditional hours that meet the needs of the students, especially if they're working students, right? Advising, counseling, and especially because they're working, our courses, whether it's in person or interaction with the instructor, should also meet the needs and the schedules of the students. Saturday morning, discussion, one-on-one discussion, office hours with faculty, 8 p.m. on a Sunday or whatever. So we need to be much more flexible, especially as we try to merge online education with, let's say, discussion groups or interaction with the faculty. The other thing that I think we need to think about is we need to start having more integration and recognition of life experiences, credentialing courses, courses and certificates and education offered by separate employers, whether it's Amazon or Google or Microsoft, along with community technical colleges, and then having those credentials count toward a degree instead of saying, oh, sorry, you only took a non-credit course at Bellevue College, and even though it's in accounting or in technology or cybersecurity, it wasn't a degree course, granting course, credit course, therefore you got to take it all over again. That makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to say is that we were, or at least I was, the album generation. You had to do everything in a particular order. You had to buy. This is the playlist generation, and they want to grab from here, grab from there, grab from the other, and then we need to package it and see when it counts. But it's a whole different ballgame.
And especially since now with technology, people can actually get their education, let's say, in Grays Harbor. They don't have to come to the University of Washington or as much. But here's the thing that I really think is that the business community and policymakers need to start thinking about. McKinsey a few years ago said that by the year 2030, 5 to 10% of the world's workforce would be displaced because of AI and robotics. Now that's of the world's workforce. Well, that's not, that 5 to 10% is not going to be in the countries like Burma or the Congo or Vietnam perhaps. So that 5 to 10% worldwide is going to be concentrated in the advanced industrialized nations like the United States, the EU, Korea, whatever, Canada and so forth. So does that mean that 5 to 10% worldwide in America might be 8 to 13%? So that means 8 to 13% of our workforce by 2030 will have their jobs gone because of AI. So today's worker who's 47, 48 years old, 10 years from now will be 58, 59 years old. So we know that the new economy, the technology creates all these new jobs. But are we going to say to that 58, 59-year-old, go back to the University of Washington or Bellevue College or Grays Harbor Community College and take a course in coding? What are policymakers doing now to prepare for that huge upheaval? And one thought I had is, obviously, education, online education, constant learning and upgrading of skills. But instead of waiting for people to be unemployed and get unemployment insurance benefits and all kinds of worker assistance programs, maybe we should be treating unemployment insurance kind of like a flexible savings account that you can draw on now for some sort of advanced training and upgrading of skills.
Lifelong learning.
Lifelong learning?
Yeah.
The vast majority of our continuum college students are exactly like that. They're not getting degrees. They're taking, basically stackable credentials, 2 classes, 3 classes, all of which are largely related to changes in the workplace.
So maybe it's we need to change our unemployment insurance laws. I mean, right now our state trust fund is kind of in dire straits because of all the unemployment during the pandemic. But assuming it gets back to some sort of fiscal health, I mean, should we be a little bit more innovative instead of waiting for the person to get out of a job, getting unemployment benefits just to put food on the table and pay the rent? Maybe we should be using it, maybe in a public-private partnership with incentives to companies to enable people to get that upgrading, upskilling before they lose the job, so they can be assured of being employed.
That's a good segue to my next question. And you mentioned badges and certificates, stackable credentials, all of that stuff. I think to get there, not only do we need the state's help, we probably need industry's help. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how higher education can better partner with industry, some of whom are giving these certificates, and we need to work with to figure out how we stack their certificates into our degree programs and that sort of thing. But how do we build that partnership in a way that encourages people whose jobs are going to disappear in 10 years to take advantage of that now without losing the role of the university in educating a well-rounded individual? Elizabeth?
Yeah, when the 3 of us put our heads together to brainstorm a little bit before the session, just to stimulate each other's ideas. And one of the things I think we all said in various iterations is that, certainly for the 4-year bachelor's degree, that, I feel really strong, I think Anna Marie said the same thing, that we're really aiming to prepare students for all the twists and turns that they will experience in their lives. I'm teaching a first-year freshman class at WSU this year because I wanted to see our first semester, first-year students. And they believe right now that their life is a straight line. I'm coming in and I'm majoring in X and I'm going to be a Y and that's what I'm going to do. And I said to them, I don't want to freak you out.
It's refreshing, isn't it?
But, I was a math major, and then I was a music major, and then I was a psychology major. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't aim for what your passion is, absolutely. But, and I do think we need to provide them with credentials that they need and skills that they need. But, I still wish Professor O'Mara was here because I'm trained as an archaeologist, so I was going to go back even farther than she was talking about. and say that in human evolution, we were hunter-gatherers for most of the past 4 million years. And do you know what humans have always done in times of scarce resources? They become flexible generalists. They do not become specialists when there are scarce resources, because you have to be prepared to eat and hunt anything that might be available. And so I think of that 4-year bachelor's as creating well-rounded hunter-gatherers who have skills that they can focus as needed. But you know what? And I have a 20-year-old son who's in college, and I tell him, this is great. You major in what you're passionate about. You aim high. But you also need to write, be able to speak, be able to be financially literate, and be prepared for whatever comes next.
Yeah, I think, that it really is, that we create, our society is doing it in droves right now, these false dichotomies. Are you going to school for a general education, for citizenship, or are you going to school for a career and a job? And the answer is, of course, both. And it's a false dichotomy that it's one or the other. I do think it's really important that as we try and work very hard, and I think we do a very good job in the state, thanks to the legislature and the financial aid that they provide, to get more working class first generation students into universities. They in particular need to understand that there's a job at the end. I ended up going into clinical psychology instead of developmental psychology because there was no question I needed a job. My parents were not going to be able to take care of me. And that way I thought, well, if I can't get a job in academia, which at that point was scarce, I can do clinical practice. And so it's very important that we make very transparent, and that's something that we're working very hard on in our College of Arts and Sciences, to make very transparent to students how working that term paper and writing that term paper, it's, project management, and, how they can translate and how they can talk about the skills that they get in a liberal arts degree into skills that translate into the workplace, because I really do think first generation students in particular need to understand that they can get a job with a philosophy degree. And so we need to do that work, but the dichotomy is a false one. I like to think of, we look for T-shaped individuals. We want them to be deep in one area, but we also want them to be broad.
Well, and the reality is that people these days, gone are the days in which our aunts and uncles and moms and dads worked at one company for 40 years, right? The Boeing company or Weyerhaeuser.
Except for me. 35 years at the University of Washington.
But you've had different experiences within that institution. And the reality is that our kids and today's workers are going to be constantly changing professions. And so it's really important that they have critical thinking skills and have that culture of lifelong learning, so that as technology changes, whether it's in the plumbing industry or carpentry, that they're able to adapt on their own. When you look at carpentry, gone are the days of using 2x10s and 2x12s. So much as laminated wood and new I-beams and things like that. So how do they adapt? I remember visiting some of our community technical colleges many years ago and visiting students in the automotive shop, and I was always asking, so do we are we really encouraging these students to take English courses and writing courses? We really want a broad-based education so that they can adapt into the future as they go on.
Yes, well, when I moved to the university, I did bring with me a set of data cards, and I've moved away from that.
Do you still have them? Did you save them for posterity?
I think that in one of our basement moves that they're gone.
They got purged.
But I do have one of the original laptops that's about that big, and I've saved that.
So I want to shift the topic a little bit and talk about the role of education in supporting racial and social justice. One of the things the pandemic brought home for me was just the disproportionate impact on communities of color. And the differences, sort of magnifying the differences between frontline and back office workers. Majority of tech workers were able to sort of flexibly work from home, and yeah, they had a lot of balanced childcare issues and kids learning from home and that sort of thing. But for lower wage frontline workers, that was impossible. They had to go to work, they still had to deal with childcare at home, and as a result, the pandemic has disproportionately affected society across racial lines. So business in general, and the tech industry in particular, talks a lot about wanting to increase the diversity of its workforce, create equity within society, and create fair opportunities. And as we think about the future of higher education, I'm curious your thoughts on what are the key initiatives that we should undertake, and what help do we need from the state and from businesses to launch those initiatives to ensure greater sort of economic equity across society? Elizabeth?
Yeah. So I think that higher education has a major role to play in both institutional and societal transformation when it comes to issues of racial justice, but equity and inclusion broadly. You know, really research universities in particular have an opportunity to leverage the power of that scholarship in studying the very issues that we care deeply about. You know, a lot of times institutions of higher ed focus on increasing the diversity of their faculty and staff and students, and that's great. But diversity is really the first step. It's really equity and inclusion and social justice that we're aiming for. So at WSU, we're not alone in this, but we launched an initiative a year and a half ago to hire 5 faculty per year in perpetuity whose scholarship and teaching is focused on racism and social inequality in the Americas. And by bringing 5 new tenure-track faculty onto our campuses every year in perpetuity, as you can imagine, after 5 years, we have 25 scholars whose teaching, community engagement, outreach, mentoring of students, and it's going to completely transform the curriculum as well. When I did this at a previous institution in our anthropology department, you know, we had an historical archaeologist who studies the African diaspora, and I can tell you that her gender and hip hop class was the most popular general education course in the university. But, you know, she had 350 students in her class every semester, and it really does transform the institutions and then trains the next generation of students who are going out in the world and working in the technology sectors and more broadly. So I think it really has to be that 360-degree view on how we transform society in the end. That's the goal.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, one of the things, you know, believe it or not, I wasn't sure that I wanted this position when I was kind of thrust into it, you know, because, you know, as an interim. And one of the things that I did to kind of get a sense of, you know, how things were going to fit is I launched a race and equity initiative. And, you know, so that we were really well positioned when this came about. Because we had something to build on, and agreed, it has to be everything. You know, right now, you know, we have had an American Ethnic Studies department. In fact, I've chaired it in the past that focuses on work on race and ethnicity. But we're also looking at, we're in the process right now, our faculty senate is looking at increasing the diversity requirement because we think it really is important. And I think that our notion is that everyone should take a general class that looks at issues of privilege, but then take a class that's focused on diversity that's more related to their field. So for example, in psychology, it might be about, you know, diagnosis, et cetera, et cetera. In engineering, it might be about, you know, how do you build buildings that are more inclusive, et cetera. So that, you know, it really is both looking at things broadly and deeply, but also absolutely the hiring of faculty is absolutely, and I do want to say the positive part, it's that it's positive. Over the last 5 years, before this year, we have increased every year in terms of hiring by about 30%, the number of hires that are underrepresented faculty. And this year, the data is not 100% in, but it looks like about 1/3 of the faculty that we've hired will be faculty from underrepresented backgrounds. And so, you know, people keep on saying they're not out there. They are. You just, you know, I mean, it's a question of recruiting. It's a question of giving them a place that they want to go. I think the idea of do you want to join with other? I remember very distinctly when I was being recruited out here, you know, I was a kid from Miami. And, you know, as my mother said, you know, this is, you know, you're moving as far away from me as you can. You know, at that point, there weren't a lot of Cubans here, although now the Seattle Art Museum, Seattle U, we're everywhere. You know, and so it was, but, you know, what really sold me on it is the Department of Psychology had a diversity committee, and those students took me out to lunch, and all of a sudden I could see how I could be here and how I could do my work here. And so, you know, I think that that's a lot of it, is that for a lot of people, they have stereotypes. And actually, you look at our demographics across the state, and they don't look that good. But we have a very deep history in the state in terms of diversity in the governor's position and in terms of Seattle mayors, et cetera. And I think we really have to tell that story. And we've started an initiative to really as faculty come in, faculty of color and first-generation faculty, of really providing mentorship from day one, because as hard as hiring is, the real issue is retention.
You know, I'd like to just touch upon a slightly different aspect. Obviously, curriculum and trying to expose our students to diversity, inclusion and societal policies, and just increase their awareness. Then, of course, it's the hiring of faculty that can really excite and impart this knowledge to our students. But, you know, Dave, at the beginning, you talked about the role of higher education, both in terms of education and serving students, but also as a major employer. Most of our staffs on our college campuses, you know, who do the grunt work and who, you know, provide the administrative services or keep the grounds clean and provide public safety, they're people of color. And oftentimes they're low-wage workers. And so we have an obligation to our own employees to really promote advancement, career opportunities, education. What can we do to ensure that they have real access to the courses that are offered? I mean, our institutions offer low or no cost tuition to staff, but do they really have the time and the ability to take advantage of those benefits? During the pandemic, it was really tough on our employees who had to be on the campus, either public safety or grounds and maintenance or various, you know, taking care of the dorms and so forth. But they needed childcare. But virtually all child care facilities in the state of Washington were shut down because of the pandemic. So how are they supposed to be able to work and provide for their kids at home? I mean, do they have to rely on relatives or others? And so the burden of this pandemic has really has been hard on you know, lower wage workers who really provide so much of the incredible services on all of our college campuses and in the business sector as well. I mean, the buildings, even if they're vacant, they were staffed, maintained, technicians on HVAC systems and security and cleaning, et cetera, typically people of color and low-wage workers who really had to still put out under incredible challenges. And so I think we as an institution have a responsibility that we need to really meet and step up to in terms of giving them lifelong learning opportunities.
You know, absolutely, and I think that that's also important in terms of when we think about, you know, remote work. You know, I mean, you know, some of our faculty were very reluctant to come back. There was no question. They could teach from home, et cetera. And some of what I talked to them about is the only thing that allows you to work from home is the fact that we have essential workers on campus, you know, keeping the place clean, making sure that your IT works, that you have people in grocery stores that are coming in, et cetera, and you have to think about that holistically. And both the low-wage workers, but also our healthcare workers. I'm very, very concerned about the kind of burnout that we're seeing there. I mean, these are folks who have, I mean, we've all suffered. The trauma of the pandemic has been there for everybody, but it hasn't been the same for everybody.
Right. Well, I think we'll take questions from the audience now. Thank you all for your comments. It's a very insightful discussion. Please.
Head to the mic if you have a question.
Good morning. My name is Tanya Carter. I'm actually the economic development strategist for the city of SeaTac. So welcome everybody to our city.
Thanks for having
As an economic developer, one of the things I just kind of wanted to make a comment or suggestion is that we are responsible, so my practice areas are business retention and expansion and workforce development. And so one of the I guess, suggestions is maybe considering working with economic development professionals in the cities, because what we're responsible for is, you know, retaining and expanding and also attracting businesses to our cities. And just as an example, one of the programs that I developed when I was actually in Auburn was between Green River College and the Auburn High School. It had to do specifically with CTE, but essentially it was a three-part program where we had a forum, and we invited all of the businesses from Auburn to come and listen to what the programs were at the colleges. And then after that, we encouraged and we actually arranged tours for them to come to Green River to see the CTE program, et cetera. And then what ended up happening was not only internships where the businesses then were recruiting, you know, the students, but what was really cool was that the businesses, as a specific example, there was a manufacturer that was doing composite work, and in one of the CTE programs, they didn't have any access to composites, and so the students weren't learning the actual skills that businesses needed. And so, anyway, you get the gist. So I just wanted to really encourage that, because that's kind of what we're charged with, and we could really use some support on that. Thank you.
You know, I just wanted to comment that it's so important, you know, of the 5 physical campuses of WSU, one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that we're serving the needs of the local constituencies where each of those campuses is located, whether it be the unique student bodies or the surrounding community, industry partners. You know, I think that's really important that we connect our locations to the locales and the people there, and work with our economic development professionals to help us figure out how to meet those needs.
And it's something our students want. I mean, they really, you know, I even talk to legislators, if they're looking for someone to do an analysis of something, our students would rather do that, would rather work on a paper that someone's going to read than one that's going to go, you know, on the shelf someplace. So those, you know, I mean, more and more students are looking for, and if we don't create, they create themselves, you know, partnerships where they actually work in industry. Absolutely.
Thanks. Other questions? Emily?
I knew this was going to be a problem. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the Career Development Advisor at Northeastern, and I'm just wondering if you see, like, with the student debt crisis and just talking about certificate programs in trade school and all these different opportunities for education, do you see that, like, the traditional four-year model ever going away at all, or if public four-year institutions will ever go away, just as these different opportunities, and the question of whether return on investment for four-year education.
Well, first of all, the traditional four-year model is already gone. I mean, most students do not graduate in 4 years anywhere. I mean, like I say, that's very much a private school model. And in many private schools, if you don't, you know, it's like, but if you look at students across the country, that model is already gone. And, you know, we do need to look more creatively. I still think it's worth looking at graduation rates, but much more people are looking at 6 years, 8 years, and I think over time that may even expand. I also think that the debt crisis, it's very important. You know, one of the things, you know, I've been doing a lot of talks virtually at Rotaries, et cetera, because I think it is really, really important. There are students out there and families who pick up newspapers and read about $100,000 worth of debt, et cetera. That is not the case in this state if you go to a public university, period. It is not the case in this state. There are wonderful financial aid our state has done a fabulous job. We at the last Apple Cup in Pullman, which was a much nicer one for us, we talked about, you know, we talked about our partnership in terms of, yes, it's possible, and the wonderful financial aid programs that we have. The majority Over 60% of the students at the University of Washington graduate with a bachelor's degree with zero debt. And of those that have debt, on average, it's just a little over $20,000 a year. We have to get, that isn't the case in every state, but we need to get that message out, because there are students who are not, who in high school are deciding they can't go to college because they don't want debt. And so it really is important to be clear. Now, the other thing is that a lot of the debt is concentrated in graduate and professional degrees. And I think we really have to look at particularly, like, for example, we're in a crisis in nursing. And we need to be partnering with the state, and we need to be partnering with the federal government in terms of loan repayment, et cetera, so that in fact you can go into that areas of critical need. But I think that, again, we need to look at this in a very careful way. I worry a lot about what families, low-income families, are learning when they pick up the paper and hear about debt crisis and how it's scaring them out of higher ed, which in fact is the thing that will create social mobility.
And the other thing, I mean, the point that you raised about credentialing and things like that, a lot of these programs, if they're really going to be the future of education, they're not, you can't get financial aid. You're not eligible for financial aid unless it's a credit granting course. And so if it's a certificate, a credential for which you don't get credit, and that's the degree model, then you're not eligible for financial aid. So we need to change our policies to reflect the reality of education.
All right, Elizabeth, I'll give you the last word.
I just wanted to say that, I think that 4-year go away to a private college, has not been attainable for most Americans throughout the 20th and 21st century. There's a great book called Shakespeare, Einstein, and the Bottom Line, which I would encourage you to read, because higher ed has been changing for the past, hundreds of years, even in this country. Earlier when we heard Professor O'Mara's talk, I was thinking about how we've been here before too. And that book really talks about how with the economy, higher ed changes with the economy and what's going on in the world. And we will get through this. It will look different in 10 years. I'm an archaeologist, so I won't predict the future, but it will be different. We'll evolve and change.
Well, thank you all. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.